terms of presenting both the Irish Government's report, but also for the Women's Council preparing our shadow report. So the Women's Council will be presenting a shadow report for submission to the CEDAW committee, and this is very much part of what today is about. The purpose of that shadow report is to highlight both issues that are not raised by the government in their report, but also as well where the government have focused on achievements where we feel they haven't made enough achievement, or where they have minimised and neglected to deal with certain issues. So we'll see our report as being quite comprehensive, and at the same time we will be putting forward very clear priorities to the CEDAW committee, because we think that that's quite critical in terms of how they hold the government to account. So the shadow report for us, we believe, is an important opportunity both to engage with you, our members, with women in Ireland, and also to engage with the committee in terms of calling to attention the issues that we feel that, that the Irish government is neglecting in terms of women's equality. So the purpose really of today is to highlight both the importance of CEDAW, its relationship in terms of Ireland, women's organisations, and to highlight as many practical ways that CEDAW can be used for campaigning and for lobbying work. And the second part of today, which will be after lunch, is to have roundtable discussions, which is really about getting your opinions, your perspectives and concerns in relation to the state's report, and that helps us put together the shadow report. I do want you to know that the intention for today, and I think it's working, is that this is being live streamed. So this is being filmed, so just so that you're aware of that. And I also should have said at the start, we want to thank the Lord Mayor's Office for using the Mansion House today. So I really hope that you enjoyed today, that you can participate as much as possible, because that's going to be really important for us, that you also get something from today in terms of thinking about how CEDAW can be used and related to your work in terms of campaigning and lobbying. So I hope it's a really useful day. And I'm going to start because we're really delighted with the panel that we have here this morning and the expertise they bring to the discussion. And the first person who's a sort of keynote person this morning is Violetta Neubar. And Violetta has such a wide range of experience in terms of this. She's come from Slovenia, and we really appreciate her travelling for the meeting this morning. And Violetta was a member of the CEDAW committee from 2007 to 2014. So her experience of being on that committee is hugely valuable to us in the preparations around our shadow report. And Violetta will also be staying with us for the full day, so we'll also be here for the discussions within the afternoon. So I think it gives you an opportunity as well to have conversations with her. So we're very grateful to her for that. And also in terms of other work, Violetta was also part of, participated in the drafting of the Istanbul Convention, which is a very core piece of our work, which is the Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. So I'm delighted that Violetta is here, and I'm really looking forward to hearing her speak.
Thank you.
Thank you. Violetta, just before, I should have said to people, sorry, just for those of you on social media, we're just using the hashtag CEDAW, and that's at NWCI. Grand. Sorry about that.
Good morning. I know I can't do justice to all of you that came together here today to explore how to better use CEDAW in your own work, and how to better use CEDAW in one of the very important role you have, and that's to keep government at account for implementing to what they agreed upon to do. But I'm really very grateful to the National Women's Council for finding out who an expert might be to join your events in the preparation for the next year dialogue of your state delegation with the CEDAW committee. And I'm really very glad to be here. I've been working on CEDAW intensively for almost 25 years, not only as serving the committee for the 2 terms, but prior to that, in Slovenia, I was a national gender equality expert responsible for the preparation of reports under CEDAW Convention. And I was always pretty much behaving very strange in terms of being a civil servant. I started to work with the government as the first person employed in the Government Office for Gender Equality in 1992. I never allowed myself to climb on the hierarchy because I wanted to remain an expert and not holding any so-called politically influenced position, because that allowed me also to be a founder member of a number of NGOs and to remain active member and activist to promote the rights of women in Slovenia, in Europe and worldwide. But with all this experience, I'm always so eager to learn more, and believe me, I always learn something new about CEDAW Convention when I meet people like you, because we end up discussing something that maybe have not yet been enough explored, or we have not yet have a crystal clear ideas about certain provisions that could be used better in a specific national context. That's my introduction, why I am honored to be here. By now, I can imagine that all of you, if not all, majority of you, are very familiar with the CEDAW Convention, given that it was adopted in 1979. But nevertheless, I realize that we have constantly to repeat what is so special about this, we call it shortly Women's Convention, or International Bill of Rights for Women. When we compare it, for instance, with European law, with European Union law, one of the first things I would like to say, CEDAW Convention, in comparison to the European Union law, in comparison to most of the national relevant legislation, is much, much broader. It has no exemptions. It doesn't give any special benefits to anyone or restrict any positive or negative behavior in relation to any person. What most of the European Union law does, it always starts in the beginning with exemptions related to the specific directive, like the one I was negotiating really toughly on equal access to goods and services. And you know, it excludes a variety of areas from the principle of equal access to and provision of goods and services. So the convention, the CEDAW Convention, really symbolizes the climax of the decades-long efforts to create an integrated legal mechanism to advance women's rights in all spheres of life and throughout their life cycle. That is why, for instance, the CEDAW Committee in Geneva works so closely with the Committee on the Rights of the Child. We are trying to engender the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the work of the CEDAW is trying to engender the work of that committee. And I could be defined as a pioneer in doing this, in gendering other human rights treaty bodies, because during my serving of the CEDAW committee, when we were moved from New York to Geneva, because CEDAW committee used to have its session in New York, and was serviced by the Division for the Advancement of Women in New York, but then the then High Commission for Human Rights wanted to have her human rights family in Geneva, and they were, of course, it was a unilateral decision, even though the convention clearly says that we sit in New York. But, okay, funding and gender equality is always the area where we can start cutting funds. That's internationally, nationally, and locally. And they were saying, yes, but you will have advantages, you will meet with other treaty bodies and so on, what's very difficult because when the experts are there, they have really a very, very busy day. But I started to explore, and I had good relations with UNICEF, and I ended up that the two committees decided to start drafting a joint general recommendation. I was the chair of that joint working group of experts of the committee that is monitoring the implementation of the CEDAW Convention and experts of the CRC. And just during the last session of my last term, we ended up by the two committees adopting the first ever joint interpretation of issues of provisions under the two different conventions on harmful practices. Harmful practices harmful to girls and women, but mutatis mutandis, when relevant, also to boys, so that also they can be used under the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So for me, that's very important. So CEDAW committee really looks at the whole lifespan of women. I must say that I understand CEDAW committee that it really became the central and most elaborative women's rights legal protection instrument, and after all, an ultimate basis for development and evolution of the subsequent women's rights and strategies to protect them. We can see now with the new Agenda 2030, the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights during the last session of the CEDAW Committee in Geneva said the agenda is the implementing instrument for the CEDAW Convention. So it means, you know, the CEDAW Convention gives a legal basis and the Beijing platform for action, now the Agenda 2020, are the implementation package for safeguarding the full enjoyment of all freedoms and human rights by women, not only on equality with men, but women on equality with women. And that is why I like the term discrimination against women. It's not discrimination on the grounds of sex. Because when you say on the grounds of sex, then you compare with men and women. Under the CEDAW Convention, we are comparing women with women. Women belonging to a variety of groups, which, because belonging, or because they are perceived to belong to certain groups, are discriminated against because their initial level of opportunities is not equal to those that might be at the best, as a group in the best position. Today, CEDAW Convention has been ratified by 189 state parties. You all know that the USA is not a member of the CEDAW Convention, and when Obama was elected, I was in the delegation that we went in Washington to persuade them to ratify the convention, but it was made very clear that the United States of America will probably never ratify this convention, as they didn't ratify a number of other human rights treaties. And the optional protocol, of course, which gave the power to the committee of experts that is serving the women of the world under this convention, was another climax of the maybe the most dramatic advance in establishing the state parties' responsibility for violation of human rights of women under the CEDAW Convention. The optional protocol, I know that we will have today a speaker that will explore how to utilize the optional protocol, which gave women and groups of women in those countries that ratified the optional protocol, as by now there are 107 state parties to the optional protocol. It means, again, quite a number of state parties to the convention do not want their women and groups of women to have a possibility to defend, to have someone that defends their rights at the global level. I will not speak further about optional protocol because it would be waste of time, but what I would like to say about the CEDAW Convention. Whatever the potential, the strength, the power of this Women's Convention is in the very text of the convention, complemented with the general recommendation that the committee is mandated under the convention to adopt in order to provide an authoritative interpretation of the meaning of the provisions of the convention to the state parties. Its strength, it only depends on adequate implementation. But for adequate implementation of the CEDAW Convention, the state parties, the CEDAW Committee, women themselves, women's rights activists, NGOs, they must understand this meaning of the substantive content. And it must be properly understood by all relevant state bodies and organs at all levels. And again, my experience in the 8 years serving this committee is that there are quite a number of states that have their own interpretation of the provisions of the CEDAW Committee and do not follow the interpretation that the committee is providing and are challenging the committee, calling on the committee, that the committee is creating new rights. No, we are not creating new rights. The committee we have not been creating new rights. The committee has just was giving flesh and blood on the bones, on the very basic substantive content to that convention through general recommendation and particularly through developing its case law with the decisions related to the complaints and inquiries under the optional protocol. Today we are all aware also that the understanding of whatever legal norms and standards, and in particularly of such a global international human rights instruments must constantly evolve. First, according to the CEDAW committee experts' dynamic, and forward-looking and progressive clarification and interpretation of the standards and substantive content of the Convention, which, of course, must accommodate the development of international law and must accommodate the development of international human rights case law. To this end, it is of critical importance that the government, the Irish government, and in particular the so-called gender equality mechanisms, institutional mechanisms, and women's human rights NGO ensure that the CEDAW Convention and general recommendation on the meaning of the provisions of the Convention are available, and accessible to all relevant state institutions at all levels of the country, but also to all other stakeholders. I would also like to share with you what, for me, when I joined the women's movement in Slovenia, was already then very important. And it's so clearly reflected in the CEDAW Convention. And these are the three core interrelated principles. And that's in the Convention. And that's principle of equality, principle of non-discrimination, and principle of state obligation. Principle of equality, you know, today we speak about substantive equality, equality of results, and not anymore only about equality of opportunities. It's also clear that to achieve substantive equality, we have to recognize that it may be necessary to treat men and women differently, and to treat women themselves differently. So, and to create, of course, this substantive equality also carry with it this concept of enabling conditions, and this is where the difference arises from creating enabling conditions to women in different situations with different initial conditions. The principle of discrimination, again, pretty much similar to what we have you have in your national legislation. What is relevant in comparison to most of the national legislation and, for instance, European Union law and the principle of non-discrimination under CEDAW Convention is its unique development and the decision under the optional protocol that stereotyping is a discrimination and that it violates women's human rights. And this was a pioneering decision also at the world level, that the CEDAW committee deciding that wrongful stereotyping, not negative, not any negative stereotyping is discriminatory stereotyping. Negative stereotyping saying, you know, women are carriers and men are breadwinners. doesn't really affect us. Yes, we are. We do care for people, and we do care for the society, and we do care for our own professional life. That's nothing wrong. It's a stereotype, but it's not discriminatory, unless, of course, we have a policy that is based on this stereotyping and this linking, giving women less opportunities to live their fully satisfied life in all the areas that today, as individuals, we are living in our societies. So this is why, and of course, CEDAW committee has developed and already had in a very origin of the text a ground for developing further intersectional multiple forms of discrimination, because you know we have Article 14 in the Convention on Rural Women. So that is where the Convention gave opened the window for the CEDAW Convention to speak about intersectionality in respect of women enjoying women guarantees of rights under this convention. Usually they are calling this group of women vulnerable groups. I myself was were always strongly hurted when we were using these terms, because women are not vulnerable. They are never vulnerable by themselves. It is the state that puts them in positions which are vulnerable, in situations which are vulnerable to women, with not acting adequately to secure that no one individual becomes vulnerable because of conditions out of her and his own physical body and all that is associated with our physiology. I'm also very proud that finally the CEDAW committee has agreed upon using the sexual orientation and gender identity as a basis for discrimination against women. It was a very, very tough battle, because the CEDAW committee is composed of 23 experts coming from different regions. They are elected by all the state parties, and it means that I was calling the CEDAW committee a real laboratorium of cultural diversity. And believe me, the committee internal dynamic, internal modus operandi, it is just the same as our parliaments do, as our governments do. When you have experts who are defending the set of their own personal values, even though experts should be independent and neutral, and that's not always the case. But anyhow, again, we are there now, and with this, I'm saying the CEDAW continues to be in an avant-garde of the international human rights legal framework. What is very important under the CEDAW Convention, and that's important for the Irish government, is the principle of state obligation. And you know that the state party has the obligation to respect, which means that the country must refrain from making laws, policies, regulations, programs, administrative procedures, and institutional structures that directly or indirectly result in the denial of the equal enjoyment by women of all their rights under the Convention. Then is the obligation, state obligation, to protect which requires a state to protect women from discrimination committed by public authorities, the judiciary, and private actors, including individuals in the public and private spheres, and take steps directly aimed at eliminating customary and all other practices that perpetuate the notion of inferiority or superiority of women and men, and women among women, and of stereotyped roles for men and women, but as I said, harmful discriminatory stereotypes. Then is the obligation to fulfill, which requires the state to take a wide variety of steps to ensure that women enjoy both the equality in law, the jure equality, and also de facto full enjoyment of rights by women, meaning enjoying them in practice, and again, not only on the basis of equality with men, but on the basis of equality among women, of women, equality for women. I like the title of this event. The human rights of women shall be fulfilled by the promotion of the substantive equality with all appropriate means, such as concrete and effective policies and programs aimed at improving the position of women and achieving such equality, and as you probably also are aware, including where appropriate with so-called special temporary measure, positive action. However, we have a variety of terms that European countries are using in that respect, but the CEDAW committee is using a term temporary special measures. So it means that this obligation of the state assigned the role to the state to be a duty holder, and a duty holder in this respect has obligation of means and of results. And the non-fulfillment of the right to equality is just as much discrimination as non-prohibiting discrimination or unequal and unfair differential treatment of two individuals of whatever gender. This has far-reaching implications for the obligation of the state, as the elimination of discrimination against women may require, according to the situation, the asymmetrical treatment. And also, I would like to say that together with the state obligation, responsibility of the state, I like very much the Article 2 in the CEDAW Convention, which says that this obligation must be implemented without delay. What does it mean? In General Recommendation 28 on the core article, Article 2 of the CEDAW Convention, the committee has explained that this means that the state cannot justify the delay in making any efforts to ensure full substantive equality of women on any grounds, including political, social, cultural, religious, economic austerity should not be a justification for not doing what the state is obliged to do and what the state agreed to do when ratified or acceded to the convention. With regard to the NGOs, that is what's the most important. The NGOs were the first ally of the CEDAW committee. And the relationship between the CEDAW committee and NGO has been really, really growing, has been formalized in 2010 when the committee adopted the statement on the relationship between the CEDAW committee and NGOs, where it was explained what is the role of NGO vis-à-vis the convention. And let me say that very often the NGOs are the only voice of women from a particular state that brings their voices to this global guardian of women's rights, to the CEDAW committee. Therefore, preparing the shadow reports or alternative reports is very important, but it's equally important to be there in all phases, to be there like was the situation for Ireland this year, because Ireland requested the CEDAW committee to be availed the opportunity to use the simplified reporting procedure, which I must agree is really a shame for your country, that the last report has been submitted in 2002, and that after 14 years the country dared to ask to use the simplified reporting procedure, which in my mind would be, for some small Pacific Island countries where they really don't have the administrative capacities and institutional capacities to do that. But okay, that's the conditions which apply to this, and now Ireland has the simplified reporting procedure, meaning the responses to the list of issues and questions that were submitted to the committee on 15 September now represent the 6th and 7th combined periodic report. I know how much you have contributed for the pre-session working group, but what I noticed, and here I would like to share our very, personal experiences with such type of shadow reporting to the committee. You have quite a high number of particular shadow reports on different concerns, on different priorities, and that really kills experts of the CEDAW committee. Let's say, okay, a rapporteur designated to be responsible for Ireland dedicate all the necessary time, but the other experts of the committee who during the same session engage in a dialogue with 8 or 12 states delegation with countries which really differ, to read such an amount of reports, in addition to all the United Nations agencies which are providing their own reports, and country teams of the UN agencies. I was once a rapporteur for one country, and the number of pages I had to read was 1,600, and that was Italy. So, you can't manage. You have 2 weeks for dialogues with the state parties, and every day a new delegation. So I would really call on you for the shadow reporting, whether you can somehow coordinate. I know it's difficult because NGOs represent very different interests and fields of their activity, but if possible, try at least to have one comprehensive, and then for particular issues where you will find that those are the priorities, you can then elaborate a more specific and targeted report to the committee. Because, saying you frankly, in particularly when they are not translated in all official UN languages. You have experts who are not good in using English. Even for me, that should be a condition for any expert to be elected to the human rights treaty bodies, but it's not. And we have colleagues who speak Spanish and do not speak English. And they cannot read your reports because they are not translated. Often, I was receiving only shadow reports in Spanish and I wasn't able to read them. So you must be aware of this specific situation. And what I would also like just to say to conclude, because my time has run out, that use the statement from 2010 on the role of NGOs vis-à-vis the CEDAW committee, because the committee in this statement really encourages the state party to provide sustained funding to NGOs in their activities relating to promotion and monitoring of the implementation of CEDAW, its optional protocol and concluding observations, and that through this funding they should also enable them to participate in the constructive dialogue with the committee. It happened in past that once Norway, we were having constructive dialogue with the state delegation of Norway, and their human rights ombuds read a paper of NGOs which informed the CEDAW committee that they couldn't come to participate in the constructive dialogue because they have no funding and the state doesn't fund their participation in Geneva. And after we issued this statement, the next time NGOs told us that they were using it and that the government funded their participation in Geneva. So if you have any problems, try to use that. But first, really, it's very important how you prepare for the dialogue next February or beginning of March. But what is equally or almost more important is that you coordinate among you and you set an action after the concluding observation will be given. How really to meet with the government, with the relevant ministries, with other relevant state institutions, in order to start immediately implementing the committee's recommendation, in particular the set of two groups of recommendation which the committee now uses to select two priorities from the recommendation, for which the state is asked to provide a report on their implementation in 2 years' time. The CEDAW committee realized that in almost majority of the state parties to the convention, CEDAW becomes relevant only when the countries see that, yeah, it's our due time to start preparing a report under CEDAW convention. And as you see in the case of Ireland, even that was not a motivator to submit the periodic report in due time. So that is, I congratulate you for all these preparatory events. And I'm glad that in the afternoon I will remain with you and we can speak more if you have any specific interest. in particular then how to engage with the CEDAW committee when you are in Geneva. But really, I urge you, start thinking what you will do afterwards, and really to prioritize, to give a hint to the CEDAW committee. What should be the follow-up concerns and the adequate recommendations? And also to give a hint to the experts that will come during the lunchtime break for NGOs briefing, when you will come to sit with those experts that will come during lunchtime for the briefing, also to see what you see as the best steps that might be realistic because of the time context. Because sometimes it's so important that you decide to prioritize certain recommendations which fit very well in the specific time context. I don't know, if you are in the process of changing certain laws, it means now is the time to come with a very, very, very strong message. And that also is more realistic for being implemented in a 2 years' time than some recommendations which might require a very, very long process to have them adequately addressed through the policy and legal measures. So I will stop here. I have much things in my mind, but when I start talking, I just...
Thank you, Violet. Thank you.
I must conclude loudly, and I must say that I can't leave this, how do you call it, roster?
Yeah.
Without wishing you and all those NGOs who are not here but have been and will be involved, and also to your state delegation, smooth and effective preparatory work and a very successful dialogue with the committee, which I'm certain will be an exciting adventure with the sole objective of better protection of human rights of women in Ireland and all over the world. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Violet. Thank you. I think you've given us a huge, I suppose, sense of the scope of CEDAW, but also in terms of how CEDAW has advanced many of the issues itself for women's rights, and I think given us really valuable advice in terms of how we prepare, I think, for our shadow report and also for going to CEDAW, how we can use the mechanism more effectively. So yeah, really thank you, and also I think people will really be able to engage with you because you're staying, so that's great. So now we're going to move on to Dr. Patricia Conlon, and Patricia is chair of the Feminism Committee of the International Law Association. She's also a board member of the European the Women's Lawyers Association, and she has published extensively in terms of women and the law and human rights. So we're really delighted to have Patricia here.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. And first of all, I'd like to thank Denise for having invited me. It's a great pleasure and an honour to have been asked. I have to say, I have found Violetta's presentation wonderful in terms of setting the scene. And I've learned a lot from it, and it just shows you cannot beat actually having been at the coalface as she has been. So I have found it very, very helpful setting the scene also for what I want to bring to you. And just a couple of background items, if I may. I have chosen to speak about 3 areas, and the reason I've chosen to speak about 3 areas is that the International Law Association, the Committee on Feminism and International Law, it's involved in a research project, and our latest report this year dealt with some comparative experiences in a number of states which have ratified the CEDAW who have people on our committee. And coincidentally, 3 of the areas we dealt with are quite topical in Ireland at the moment, not just because of the CEDAW reporting cycle, but also because there have been some developments, or are going to be some developments, and fingers are crossed that there will be some developments. So that is why I have chosen these 3 areas. And for those of you who might have some interest in a broader treatment of the areas and the relevant footnotes where you can follow up, I will ask Denise to include the website of the ILA where you can then get the committee's reports, and you will also have here my email. If anybody has a question, please feel free to contact me. And the second sort of background comment I'd like to make is I am the secretary of the Irish branch of the International Law Association, and everybody is welcome to join. You don't have to be a lawyer, you merely have to be interested in international law. So if you have any interest, again, look at the website and you have my email. That's the commercial. Okay. So I have brought along some slides, not because I want to read them out to you, but merely because it allows me to have a structure and also to give you some wording that you can then consult later. This is the structure of what I plan to deal with, and I will do my best to follow those, because I can very easily deviate. So that's really just for me, but it will also give you wording that you can refer back to and comparisons. So ratification, you might be interested to know, although the treaty stems from 1979, we ratified it in 85, and then we ratified the optional protocol in 2000. Periodic reports. As you can see, we have submitted 7 periodic reports up to and including 2016, and you have the sort of timelines there. We have tended to be late. I think if one were to delve into the records, you will see the reason we have been late is work overload in the relevant departments. And I offer you that because that's what I've read, and all I can say is we all recognise that people can be overloaded, no question, all of us have been, but it also says a little something perhaps about the listing of priority tasks. But I wouldn't like to criticise any civil servant who's trying to do his or her level best. So we are bang up to date, which is why I thought it was quite useful to tackle or address you with my 3 topics, which by coincidence we have dealt with in our international report. So Violetta has given us a super overview of the treaty itself, but I'd also like to draw your attention to the fact that not just relevant treaty articles are of importance, but also the so-called general recommendations. They can flesh out what is in the treaty itself. And also I draw your attention to, and I use a broad term, the Beijing documentation. And that brings us right up to the 2030 agenda. So I'm going to just give you a little tiny example of stereotyping, which is my first topic. And I really like this quotation because I think it says so much. I came across it in a report on the civil service just after the foundation of the state was examined, and this was published in 1936. And when I read this, my eyes popped out. Would anybody think that these are tasks peculiar? Isn't it a wonderful word? Peculiar. I've had to translate that for other people. To women. So what I'm saying is that before the 1937 Constitution came about, we actually had certain thought processes. I'll leave that with you. I had lots and lots of other examples, but and you will find some of them in the ILA report, footnoted. And at this stage, could I recommend 2 books to you to read that I found very useful? It was Nuala Fennell. Some of you may remember Nuala Fennell. And she had her autobiography, and I must say I enjoyed it in terms of the path she had to take. And another one that perhaps is not so familiar to you is the biography of Thecla Beer. And many of you will be familiar with the name of Thecla Beer. She was definitely an impressive woman. She she chaired the first Commission on the Status of Women. And again, you will find somebody who, while she was successful, she was the first female Secretary General of a department. She really was a feminist and was not afraid to say so. So those are two books that, you know, you could read them on the beach if you found time. So stereotyping has been much criticised, and it has in fact been going on since the very early days of the CEDAW reports. And what has been criticised and continues to be criticised, because it's one of the questions from the CEDAW Committee to Ireland, is what's going to happen about this article of the Constitution. And I was interested in what Violetta said about stereotyping, because, and I have given you a quote from the 1972 Commission on the Status of Women about how destructive stereotyping can be. How it says you can get rid of discrimination, but the stereotyping, in fact, has longer tentacles. And if you look at the Irish report, which we will look at in a moment, you will see how the government is responding to the question on stereotyping. And they have dealt with it in an extensive way, but they focused on education, which is important when you look at where women are represented in educational levels. But we're now presented with a challenge, because as we all know, this is an article of the Constitution, and how do we change the Constitution? And Violetta drew our attention to the fact that the state is obliged to meet its obligations. So how does the state meet its obligations if it is up to us, the electorate, to go out and change it? And don't forget that some people will really cling to this article of the Constitution because they subscribe to the sentiments which it conveys. And it would be so easy to use these sentiments in a negative way. So it's not going to be easy. As most of you will know, there has been a constitutional convention which discussed this and reported in 2013 and recommended that it go to a referendum. And the then Minister for Justice, Alan Shatter, explained that he was very supportive of the change, but the proposal, the proposed wording, just he felt wouldn't work, to take out women and to insert carer. So it is going to be a challenge. But this continues to be criticised as stereotyping women and having the impact as referred to in the 1972 Commission on Status of Women, that you just have this image, this is what women do. And if we link it back to work peculiar to women, you can see how, in fact, a picture can be built. So all of you will have your say, and that is on the coming up ahead of us. And I've also given you the quotation in the 1972 Commission on the Status of Women, where it talks about getting rid of discrimination, but you're still left with the impact of stereotyping. So that is another piece of written work I could recommend. If you haven't read it, you might like to. It can be difficult to find, but I've given you in the report, you will find a web link to it. And this is what the CEDAW committee says about stereotyping. And you notice there it says, and it fits in with what Violetta said about obligations of states. States parties shall take all appropriate measures. So that leaves it up to the member states, the state party, to decide what the appropriate measure is. Remember, in our case, to change the Constitution, it is up to us to say yes or no. So consider the difficulty the government will have in the Attorney General in finding a wording. Constitutional Convention has reported on it. The then Minister for Justice has explained the difficulty. So, how are we going to square that difficulty with states parties shall take all appropriate measures? Article 5 is very important in general, not just for stereotyping, through the wording of state parties shall take all appropriate measures. So it could be seen almost as a thread running through the convention itself. these were the questions then from the CEDAW committee, the treaty body, and that's what the Irish government had to respond to. So I'm putting it there so that you have a continuation of what the treaty says, the question and the answer. And the Irish report is interesting in relation to stereotyping. It actually deals with it from an educational point of view and the defence forces. I had to sit back and think, but what about the Constitution? And what about education? You find those in other parts of the Irish report. Okay? So I just draw that to your attention. And it does refer there to the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, and I must say anything I've seen from that body has been very impressive in general. And I've given you the paragraphs where you'll find the other Irish report. In terms of Article 41.1 of the Constitution, I've sort of summarised what the Irish report said, that it was in the programme for partnership government, referring back to the Constitutional Convention, which was published in May 2016. Now remember, our election was in February, and we had eventually a partnership government, and this is where we find a commitment to have a referendum. I repeat again, it's up to the electorate to decide, and then states parties shall take all appropriate. What will the government then do? The referendum is to be held, we were told, and the government also said in its report that the Constitution had discussed it, as I said, and also mentioned that it had been discussed in the law. Public and political life was the second area we chose in our committee to deal with, but that's linked to stereotyping. And I chose to draw to your attention because it also comes under a broader term which we find in the Beijing documents, women in power and decision making. And what we try to emphasise in our report, drawing on some research done by Mary Robinson's Foundation, that power and decision making has to be actually meaningful, because what we found is that it's not unusual for women sort of to be put forward as token persons, but actually what role have they got? And sometimes one should look at members of a government and ask yourself, what actual portfolios do they have? So I think it's not just numbers. And I just invite you, because it's dealt with in our report, to look at where our four female ministers are. You know? Who holds the purse strings? Not one. And that's really meaningful. That's not to say that there aren't other areas that are really important and can impact on life. But at the end of the day, you know the song, money makes the world go round. So Article 7 and Article 8 are the relevant treaty articles in terms of participation in political life. And then we've got general recommendations, particularly 23 and 24, and the Beijing documents. I just draw that to your attention. And in its report, and I've given you the relevant paragraphs, and I've drawn out just some highlights. It addresses women in the Dáil, 22.2%, which is the highest ever since, to use that awful phrase, the foundation of the state. Right? 22.2. But the Beijing documents tell us that to get any change, you need a critical mass of 30%. And I can tell you that of the 193 countries which are whose stats are published by the Interparliamentary Union, only 25% of those 193, in fact, hit that 30% critical mass. So Ireland is below that, but that is the highest we have ever had. And I will come back to the highest that we've ever had in a moment. We have 26% are members of the government. I have to say, by my calculations, I had worked at 27%. But if the Irish report says 26, so I will run with that. And And then I just have to bring your attention to the Ministers of State. To 18 Ministers of State. Now remember, members of the Parliament are constrained numerically by the Constitution. 15, according to the Constitution. There is no restraint numerically, constitutionally, on Ministers of State. What would you have expected? Would it be unreasonable to say 50-50? I respectfully suggest that balance was not a factor there. It was geographical distribution and also bringing together a government, remember, partnership government. But I just thought that that was a missed opportunity because the Irish Times had reported that the Taoiseach had promised a 50-50 cabinet. Right? We have exactly the same percentage women in cabinet this time as we had last time, even though we have the highest number of women elected. I calculated 6% difference. There's a difference between my calculation and the government report, but shall we say we'll agree that there are more women, but still the same percentage, missed opportunity. And then I just draw out, just to give you a flavour, the other areas that they deal with. There's no question that there have been changes. There have been efforts, there's training, there's encouragement, etc., etc. So there have been changes and people are moving up the food chain. Not fully. One very fascinating thing I find as a lawyer is that in the legal hierarchy, all the leaders are women. So statistically, it's impossible. But I feel like Gareth Fitzgerald used to talk about something that would work in practice, but not theoretically. But all the leading lawyers, are women, plus some others which you'll find listed in the report. Interestingly, the courts actually showing, with the exception of the High Court and the Court of Appeal, women are very well represented there when you consider how poor it used to be. And I can't give you a reason for it. I can give you a reason for the higher number of women elected, and that would be two things. Thanks to people like you, civil society going out and helping, right? No question. But also, again, we come back to money, the 2012 Political Funding Act, which tied quota candidates, being absolutely democratic, to funding. That brought them out. But one statistic I omitted here because I was rushing. There were 16 constituencies which returned no women. There was one constituency which had no woman standing. Now, I hope I'm right. I went through all of the paperwork. I find that fact, and I haven't heard anybody talking about it. How did it happen? Is it that women were, shall we say, they were sort of, what they call in the country, the hind-tit person, right? Just a sweeper. I mean, I won't tell you what my constituency is, but I found the choice for one party of a particular one strange. So, how come we have 16 constituencies with no women elected? Is that in fact, to be devil's advocate, well actually, people don't vote for women, because that used to be the argument. So I offer you those figures. And then state boards, I was an elected member of the state board on three consecutive elections. To go for the by-election, I was elected again, and all the rumblings only, you can't have women, having a women's seat. And on my last outing, I got a quota and a half, so I thought, that's clear to that. Undemocratic approach having women only. And there was a lot of discussion that it was really undemocratic to lay down a quota, because that prevented people voting for the person they really wanted, which might be a man. And I did see where women who might have been in different constituencies of my state board, they might have been lower down in the actual voting percentage, but they actually jumped over men who had got higher votes further up. So I'd offer you just as practical experience. But we haven't reached the state target, which has been there since the 1990s, of 40%. We're creeping up into the high 30s, but some state boards just go on and on. So my broad assessment of the whole thing is there have been improvements, including in the areas I've touched on, but there's an awful lot more to do. I've drawn your attention to the developments in the judiciary and the legal officers. State boards improved, but it remains poor. I've told you that the rating documentation speaks about 40%, 30% being the critical mass, and it is really distressing to think that we haven't reached that, even with the political funding. Remember, 16 constituencies have no women elected, one constituency, despite the loss of money. And I won't tell you which constituencies these are. You will find this if you want to know in my footnotes. But one, because I don't want to blacken any constituency's name. So therefore, if you find it as publicly available knowledge, then my hands are clean. But it does say something. I mean, you just have to think about it. If you're given the opportunity and you don't vote for women, that's why I wanted to draw it to your attention. You do know that there was a challenge, a court challenge against this, and this man lost on the basis that he didn't actually have standing, that Fianna Fáil agreed to having this political funding legislation. But it's interesting that he did challenge it because it hadn't been really popular, as you can imagine, among those who had been a long time serving in the Dáil. And indeed, many women, many existing women deputies, when it was first mooted, didn't really approve of it. So it's not a set thing. It has made a difference, but hasn't made enough of a difference. And then we've ended up with 50-50 cabinet by the Taoiseach, and I thought that I had put in a photograph there of the ministers of state. Have I missed it? Yeah. I thought, you know what they say about a picture saying 1,000 words, right? Or better than 1,000 words. These are the ministers of state. Fine body of men, you will agree. And they to boost the females, that's nasty of me, but to add in an extra woman, we have the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach. We have the 4 ministers of state. Did nobody even look at that picture before they had it published? I mean, I took that from the newspaper. How could they? I was waiting for somebody to write to the paper. Perhaps I should have done it myself. So, that I hope is of some interest to you, and anybody who wants to actually read the report from which I drew the research, Denise will include the website, and if not, you have my email address. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patricia. I think it was really useful taking us through the sort of example that you did in terms of stereotype and as to how it appears in CEDAW and then how the government actually reports it or doesn't report it. I thought it was just a very concrete example of how this sort of process is working, as well as putting up the stark statistics. It just, I think, shows you how hard it is to bring about change and why we do need measures like quotas. I'm now going to ask Sinead Lucy. Sinead Lucy is a practicing solicitor with particular expertise in human rights and equality, and she's also the managing solicitor for the Free Legal Advice Centres. So we're really grateful that Sinead could be here. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure if it's morning or afternoon, so I'll just say hello. At this stage, I got the midday slot. I suppose not quite going from the ridiculous to the sublime or the sublime to the ridiculous. Maybe it started with the sublime. I'm going to go to the practical. So I suppose my expertise isn't particularly in CEDAW. I'm a working solicitor. I've pretty much picked up what I know about human rights from working with clients and trying to find practical solutions to their problems. And human rights is very useful, and the language of human rights is very useful in that regard. So this morning, I'm just going to set a little bit of context in terms of linking the domestic sphere of human rights protection with the international sphere of human rights protection, identifying some of the barriers that we experience in accessing what seems to be the promise of international human rights law, and how do we relate that to the individual on the ground in the domestic setting. And then I'm just going to look on a somewhat more positive note at possible avenues we can explore for using international human rights law at home as such. So, thank you. So in the domestic sphere, we've heard the Irish Constitution referred to both, I suppose, negatively and positively this morning, but it is the first statement of the state. It is the primary human rights, I suppose, the primary human rights instrument of the state, and the fundamental rights provisions are contained in Articles 40 to 44. Sometimes the Constitution is perceived as blocking rights, but at the same time there are very positive statements about human rights in there as well, so we shouldn't ignore it. There's domestic legislation, some of that derived from constitutional rights, some derived from elsewhere. I'm particularly emphasising here that we have a quite sophisticated anti-discrimination code in terms of our equality legislation. There are the Equal Status Acts, which protect against discrimination in the supply of goods and services, and then the Employment Equality Acts, which obviously address issues of discrimination in the employment context. But I think they're of core importance in the context of what we're talking about this morning. I should also refer there in terms of domestic legislation to the European Convention on Human Rights Act 2003, which is a form of incorporation into domestic law of the European Convention on Human Rights and gives it effect in the domestic sphere. And then, going on from that, the courts pronounce on matters of law, clarify and develop the law, and that all becomes part of the rights protection landscape that we experience. So that's the domestic sphere. So outside the borders of the state, we have the international sphere of human rights protection. So we have international human rights law, we have the treaty provisions and general comments that flow from them. So this morning we heard about CEDAW and the general comments, the expert comments there, giving flesh to the particular articles of the convention, which are very important. But one important point here is that Ireland is a dualist state. And Article 15 of the Constitution says that the only body that can make laws for the state is the Oireachtas. So just because Ireland ratifies an international treaty doesn't mean that treaty becomes automatically part of our domestic law. And that can be a very frustrating reality for all of us. We're told we have these rights. We can look to CEDAW. It's a statement that any woman could look to and say, well, I have all these rights that I can claim, and yet if she goes to her local court, she can't necessarily assert them in a straightforward way. So that's one of the big issues that we have to address. But being aware of it means that you can negotiate that space and manoeuvre around it and still use those international instruments. So in terms of regional protection, as has already been mentioned, we have EU law, and EU law is somewhat different from other, I suppose, laws that come from outside the state, in the sense that by virtue of changing our constitution, we have given supremacy to EU law. So there isn't really a question of, oh, does our constitution clash with EU law? How do we negotiate that? It really doesn't matter. EU law has supremacy in the state where relevant. We have the treaty provisions setting up the EU institutions. We have the jurisprudence of the Court of Justice of the EU. And most recently, since 2009, we have the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms of the EU. This is probably, the case law under the Charter is still developing, but it is very significant. And I've just highlighted there, it's I suppose if you read it, it looks like a new generation human rights instrument just because of some of the rights that are enshrined there, like rights of children, the rights of the elderly. It also addresses disability. In relation to equality, in Article 23, It enshrines gender equality in all areas. It particularly emphasises employment, but it does refer to all areas, and does allow for positive discrimination for the underrepresented sex. So obviously it's equal in terms of men and women, but whatever the context is may dictate who can benefit from that. There has been case law of the Court of Justice of the European Union that very much limited the scope in which a state could actually engage in positive discrimination, particularly in employment law. And I'm not really sure as yet whether there's been a case where the state sought to defend positive discrimination by drawing on the Charter, which would seem to give a broader scope for that positive discrimination. Then there's the Council of Europe, and in particular the European Convention on Human Rights, which, as I mentioned, has been given a certain form of force in the domestic context. So I am going to skip over this. This is really just sources of international law and where it gets its legitimacy from, but I don't think we're really concerned with that this morning. So, in seeking accountability from the state in relation to international human rights law and compliance, what can we do? So some of this has been referred to already and is familiar to you. So we have the periodic reporting cycles under the various treaties, where expert committees reviews the performance of the state over a particular period of time. And within that, obviously, there are opportunities for shadow reporting, which is obviously something that's very significant in today's discussion. And there's the mechanism of the list of issues which nets down the issues to be addressed. So, then there's the role of national human rights institutions and NGOs in participating in the dialogue around that periodic examination of the state's performance. And then we come down to the opportunities for making individual complaints and collective complaints, and I'm going to discuss that in more detail in my paper. But finally, I just refer to the UPR, which I often think is kind of an opportunity to have another bite at the cherry, so you get your concluding observations at one point, nothing is happening, what am I going to do? Well, raise it through the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review, which goes in a 4-year cycle and involves a peer review between states in terms of their human rights performance, results in various recommendations which may be accepted or rejected by the state or put under some kind of consideration. But it does involve another opportunity to raise a particular issue where maybe it isn't getting traction at the domestic level. So I'm just listing there the various human rights treaties to which Ireland has signed up, just referring to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is often said not to be binding but may well have the status of customary law. Then we have the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and I suppose in terms of women's reproductive rights, we're most familiar recently with the complaint taken by Miss Amanda Mellett in relation to access to abortion in Ireland, where she was pregnant and found out that the fetus had a fatal fetal abnormality. I know that's a contested term, but just for shorthand here, where she was obliged, she wanted to access termination, didn't feel she could go on with the pregnancy for obvious reasons, was obliged to travel to the UK with all that entailed for her, and I think part of the context was that she wasn't financially particularly well off, so this actually put her under considerable financial pressure on top of all the emotional cost to her in terms of the travel and having come back to Ireland and the arrangements involved in that. So the Human Rights Committee looked at her complaint, and this wasn't a complaint that she brought before the domestic courts. She went straight to the Human Rights Committee with her complaint, they found that she had suffered discrimination and also inhuman and degrading treatment. And that's obviously had very significant repercussions at the domestic level in terms of putting pressure on the state to address the particular situation of a woman in that circumstance. We have ICESCR, the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. There is a complaint mechanism under ICESCR similar to all the other treaties, but Ireland hasn't ratified it and appears to have no particular plan to ratify it. The Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, Convention Against Torture, Convention on the Rights of the Child, where Ireland has very recently ratified the complaints mechanism, which is a positive development. We have CEDAW and the complaint mechanism there, which has been ratified. And then, most imminently, the state plans to ratify the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. That has a complaint mechanism as well, and the state says that it will also ratify the complaint mechanism. And just referring back to Violetta and the kind of cross-fertilisation between the human rights treaties, it is noticeable that there's a very specific article in the UN CRPD on the rights of women with disabilities, which will obviously cross-fertilise with CEDAW as well, no doubt, into the future. So, turning now to CEDAW itself, having set that context, the complaint mechanism under CEDAW is contained in its optional protocol and provides that the expert committee that supervises compliance with CEDAW is mandated to receive communications from individuals or groups submitting claims of violations of rights protected under the Convention, and also separately to initiate inquiries into situations of grave or systemic violations of women's rights. And this must be based on receipt of some form of reliable information. As far as I could see, and I'm subject to correction on this, Violetta can tell us, I've only seen one inquiry on the website, but maybe there are more. I don't know if there are more. 3.
Apparently there are 3.
Oh, okay, very good. So obviously the individual complaints are quite distinct from the inquiries, which obviously look at very serious issues, but also systemic issues that obviously affect a large group of women in a particular context. So in terms of making a complaint, first the person making the complaint or the group of individuals making the complaint must be a victim of the particular harm complained of. Now, there is some nuancing in relation to that a representative action could be taken, but it would appear that there would have to be some form of justification for why a representative is taking the action rather than the complainants themselves or the victims themselves. The complaint must be in writing, must not be anonymous, and they're all straightforward enough. The complainant must have exhausted domestic remedies unless such remedy is too prolonged or unlikely to provide a remedy. Now that is a huge hurdle, I think, in terms of getting as far as the CEDAW committee, and I'm going to look at that in a little bit more detail. Another point here is in relation to the admissibility criteria, and there are a number of other admissibility criteria, but they're straightforward and obvious and common sense enough. But one of them is the temporal limitation on bringing a complaint. So it isn't possible to bring a complaint in relation to an issue that was done and dusted before ratification of the convention by the state, or indeed before ratification of the optional protocol. And Ireland ratified the optional protocol in 2000. So in that regard, and I think it's natural with any rights movement where there's been historic injustices, it's only when the language of rights is being engaged and when people begin to seize their rights that those historical injustices begin to come to the fore. And I think it's really only now Ireland is beginning to look at its own history in relation to the treatment of women. So we've had the Magdalene laundries, the treatment of women in relation to childbirth and symphysiotomy, and other issues, and no doubt other issues will come to the fore in the future. But there is a difficulty there as to how you seek redress for those issues where you have this temporal limitation. Now, I think the Magdalene Laundries is a case in point in terms they could give a master class in terms of the Justice for Magdalene groups as to how you seek justice at an international level. But that is an issue that has to be addressed in thinking about bringing forward a complaint as well. So now, coming to the exhaustion of domestic remedies, and I've taken a quote here from the committee itself, where it looked at one particular communication which dealt with a complaint from a woman who had lived in the UK, had moved away from the UK. She was a UK citizen, but she was seeking citizenship for her child, and she was treated differently as a mother than the father would have been treated if he was a UK citizen. That makes sense. So she was claiming discrimination on that basis. But it was found there, and it was stated, in line with the long-standing jurisprudence of other international human rights treaty bodies, in particular the Human Rights Committee, the CEDAW Committee considers that authors of communications are required to raise in substance before domestic courts the alleged violation of the provisions of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, which enables a state party to remedy an alleged violation before the same issue may be raised before the committee. So, the person must first raise in substance their complaint before the domestic courts, unless there's no point doing so, of course. That doesn't mean that the person has to bring a claim on the basis of CEDAW before the domestic courts, but the core of their complaint must have in some way been raised with the state. The person must have sought in some way to seek a remedy for it before they can ever go off and make a complaint to the CEDAW committee. That has, if we look at the European Convention on Human Rights, it has a similar provision, and most cases are deemed inadmissible simply because the person didn't exhaust domestic remedies. But how available are those domestic remedies to most people? So if you're looking at a piece of law in the Irish context that discriminates against women and a woman wants to challenge that, it means she has to go off to the High Court. Does she have the means to go off to the High Court in the first place? Can she get access to the legal representation? If she does, can she run the risk of an adverse costs order against her if the state actually wins its case before the domestic courts? And I think the Louise O'Keefe case that many of you are probably familiar with, where she took the case in relation to her abuse in a national school, but had to go through a very traumatic process before the courts, before she ever got to the European Court, and her final vindication in terms of her human rights. This is a really huge issue, and I think in the Irish context, cost is probably the biggest thing in terms of going to the courts, and it can be an insurmountable issue. So I'm not sure what argument you can raise there, but I think it's very unlikely that cost alone would be sufficient for the committee to look at the complaint without it having been aired in the domestic context. And that's why I want to swing back to something earlier and the importance of our equality legislation in terms of litigating claims of discrimination. The Workplace Relations Commission is now dealing with those complaints, and it's a somewhat unfortunate fact it doesn't refer to equality, but nonetheless it's there, it's free, it's a free avenue in which people can litigate their issues where they feel they've been discriminated against. It's accessible. So it is important that we kind of go back to basics and make sure that if we think we're on the long road to the CEDAW committee, that we start at that level. So just another few points in relation to the complaint mechanism under CEDAW. Interim measures are available, so once you have submitted your complaint, you can ask for some kind of interim measure if there's some ongoing threat to your rights if that's serious, and that would involve a communication to the state in terms of taking action. The examination of the complaint is in private, and the views and recommendations of the committee are then submitted to the party. The state then has 6 months to respond in relation to those views and recommendations, and this may in due course be followed up in the periodic reporting cycle. There's also protection from victimisation, so because you bring a complaint, shouldn't mean that you can then be victimised by the state, and that's specifically addressed under the optional protocol. So, taking all that, we can see that some of the factors inhibiting the use of international human rights law instruments are first the need to exhaust domestic remedies. There may also be a perception that the remedies are inadequate. Now, for some people to get a statement from an international human rights body confirming that their rights have been violated is enough. But that may not be sufficient for everyone, and it doesn't lead to the type of tailored remedies that you can get through a domestic court. It should obviously lead to a process at the domestic level, however, in terms of vindicating those rights, but that isn't an immediate consequence. And also, again, just coming back to the dualist nature of our legal system, where there's no immediate connection between the domestic sphere and the international sphere. So, how do we get around this? Well, first, we really need to be raising these human rights arguments before our domestic courts. And this is probably very much addressed to the lawyers in the room. But these are some of the ways that you can raise these arguments before the courts. You can't go straight in and say, Judge, I want you to adjudicate on Article 8 of CEDAW. He'll say, or she will say, I'm not doing that, bye-bye. So you have to be a bit more sophisticated about how you get it in there without being too obvious about it. So there is a presumption of conformity between Irish law and international human rights law that can be relied on. You can use international standards as a form of so-called persuasive authority. So your argument here is there's a particular right under the Constitution, there's a right to equality under the Constitution. How do we understand that? Well, we have an instrument at an international level that tells us a lot about equality, whether it's gender equality and so on. So I'm not saying that you have to adjudicate on that. All I'm saying is it will be very helpful to you, Judge, in deciding what the issue is here and deciding it under our own Constitution. That works reasonably well. Once you're respectful of the limitations on the particular court, they will be open to listening to those arguments so long as you put it in the right packaging. And then using human rights law as a source of law to shed light on unsettled law. So if there's something that's unclear in the domestic context, you can say, well, this has already been tackled at an international level, and this will be really useful to you in deciding what it means at a national level. And I suppose an example of this was a particular case I was involved in around in relation to imprisonment for debt, for a contractual debt, which is prohibited, and it was accepted it was prohibited, but the case was around the processes by which somebody was protected from being detained on foot of breaching contractual debt. And within that, there had really been no case law at an Irish level in relation to what that meant. So practically 90% of the argument was around looking at international examples of where other courts had looked at this particular issue and concluding observations under the ICCPR from the Human Rights Committee. It's only 1 or 2 lines in the judgment, but ultimately it swung the judgment in terms of striking down the domestic laws which didn't provide enough protection. So it is really important. Just for the purpose of this talk, I took a quick check on the court's website and looked at judgments and put in a keyword search under CEDAW, I came up with 2 cases. One case where CEDAW was referred to in the most fleeting way possible, and the second case was a case that's been referred to already by Patricia, Moen and Ireland. And before I come to Moen, the reality is CEDAW isn't being used before the domestic courts. It really isn't, and it deserves an outing there. So it's worth bearing in mind. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, UNCRPD, obviously the ECHR and the ICCPR come up much more often. So CEDAW, for some reason, is a Cinderella in that context. So I think that's even before the UNCRPD has been ratified. So there's something going slightly askew there. In the Moen case, it was the state itself that relied on CEDAW as justifying gender quotas in relation to nominations for election. And I suppose it's kind of funny to note that the plaintiff, when I looked at it, the gender quota applied to both men and women, but the complaint was about the women's gender quota, not the men's gender quota. So there you go. So it's worth reading if anybody gets a chance to read it. But it is very positive to see the state itself relying on CEDAW as justifying a proactive measure, and they're to be commended in that regard. So I am not going to spend very long on this, but there are other avenues open to civil society and other actors in terms of raising international human rights standards, intervening before the European Court of Human Rights. There's also an opportunity where there has been a judgment against the state. An NGO, any entity at all, can make submissions in relation to how the state complies with that judgment. And I suppose I'm pointing that out here because there was a judgment against the state in relation to reproductive rights in the A, B and C case. So it would have been open in that context for NGOs with particular interests or groups or individuals to make submissions as to how the state should actually comply with that judgment. It's a very accessible process. It's not difficult at all to make a submission. Intervening in cases before the domestic courts, there have been some slight developments there around NGOs participating as an amicus curiae, and that could be looked at as well. Also, NGOs could be called on to give their expertise in a particular case, to give evidence. I refer to the Human Rights and Equality Commission there and the powers that they have in terms of advancing rights, as I've referred to the EU Charter as well, probably underexploited at this stage. In terms of the Constitution, this has already been referred to by Patricia and explored, but one of the thoughts I had was in replacing Article 41.2.
Yeah.
41.1, sorry. 41, yeah, I should know. But I think the amendment or the referendum that we had in relation to children's rights is quite interesting because we now have a statement of children's rights in the Constitution. Where are we going to figure out what those rights are? It seems to me that when that constitutional amendment is relied on, the state or the courts are going to have to rely to some extent, at least, on the CRC, on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, to actually understand what do we mean by children's rights. It's not set out in the Constitution. So I just wonder if there's an example there that we could all be thinking about. Finally, and I know I don't really have time to discuss this, but I do want to highlight the public sector duty. So the public sector duty is a new provision brought in under the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission Act 2014. It was enacted in November 2014, and there's been some specific work done by IREC in terms of the National Human Rights Institution, an equality body, and also on the NGO side by the Equality and Rights Alliance, in terms of elucidating what does that public duty mean. But it really means that the consideration of human rights and equality should be front-loaded into the considerations of public bodies when they're engaging in decision-making, policy-making, and so on. I think there's opportunities there to get in those international human rights standards. There may be technicalities around that, but I think in the spirit of the public duty, I don't think anybody can reject international human rights standards as a means of informing that public duty and creating an ongoing dialogue between the state and civil society in terms of what does human rights mean, how do we measure the impact in terms of decisions and policy making, and how each public body must show they're complying with it. It's not a tick box exercise. They must show they've had meaningful engagement with the human rights standards involved. I'm going to finish there because I know I'm out of time. But thank you very much for listening.
Thanks. Thank you. So we have a bit of space now for if there's questions from yourselves in relation to things that have been raised by the panel. So there is a roving mic. Yeah, great. And if you want to just indicate that you want to speak, and maybe you just say your name and if you're from an organisation so that people have a sense of that. Would anyone like to ask something or make a comment on what they've heard? Oh, sorry. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Just trying to draw for this. That's probably the best I get.
I guess a question for Violetta. I think that was incredibly interesting, and it's fascinating to see that perspective coming from the community background. I suppose there's an insight there that we rarely have, especially I think as NGOs engaging outside. Our submissions around CEDAW have focused on, I suppose, both protection and also protection and also respect. I have a question in relation to Ireland's obligation in terms of international cooperation with other countries, something that's more so, I suppose, in respect rather than protection. So, UN Special Rapporteur for President Secretary really highlighted in her final report during duty that Ireland's domestic laws and Ireland's respect of their international human rights obligations have to take account of the impact of Ireland on other countries. I think we have issues both in respecting the particular discriminations of chocolate women in Ireland, but also the place that Ireland positions itself internationally and the way in which our practices are affecting other countries' ability to realise domestic resources, in terms of their tax policies, the impact of our overseas development aid and humanitarian spend, how that impacts on them. And if there's, I suppose, anything from a CEDAW committee perspective in terms of highlighting that obligation to respect international cooperation and other states' duties around CEDAW, and especially with respect to the economic, social and cultural rights, which is so important in considering the discrimination going on is one of the very section of reproductive rights and access to fundamental public services.
Okay. No, that's okay. Yeah, Grant. I'm going to take a few and then come back at the end to the panel. So, is there anyone else? There was somebody. Did you? Yeah.
Hi, Alison Ferrer from the Planning Association, and thanks very much to all the panelists. I just had a couple of questions specifically around the CEDAW complaints mechanisms. Just in terms of comparison with the mechanism with RCCPR and the data case, is there an obligation to exhaust domestic remedies under RCCPR, or how is Mandela able to make the complaint directly? And then secondly, in terms of the temporal limitation, with the fact that the 8th Amendment was inserted into the Constitution 2 years prior to Ireland's ratification of CEDAW, would that impact in terms of the complaint, or the fact that the effects of so being felt, would that be sufficient?
Anyone else?
Hi, Fiona Walsh, recovery expert for experience. I suppose it's just really a clarification Sinead, because you referenced just in relation to the COPD that Ireland was ratifying COPD and the optional protocol, but very much I think Walter and here and people in Europe and a feeling of what's proposed is that it will be done with reservation or declarations to ensure that people who have women, particularly who've had their rights abused, will not have recourse to take a complaint. And I think particularly in terms of emotional health and mental health diagnosis, we've lost children. That avenue is going to be open, and I think they're very clear about that in presentations that they've made over the last year. So just to clarify that, they will ratify, but it will be, from what I gather, with reservations and declarations.
Is there any more questions, comments? No? Okay, I'll go back to the panel and, before we break for lunch, and just feel free to let me know if there's other final comments that you want to make. So maybe I'll go to you, Violet, in terms of first question.
Yeah, I must admit I have to apologize when listening to people who speak such a speedy English. I'm lost. I'm sorry. Can you just make it very, very clear what was, because it was quite a long comment and question. It's about, of course, the Ireland situation in international context, international cooperation, and the role that Ireland has in that context, and the respect for human rights. Yeah.
That's pretty much it. I suppose how do you see that in terms of respecting the obligations under CEDAW?
In terms of what the Irish government is doing in other countries, or the impact of the Irish government's policies in other countries.
Yeah.
That was what you were saying. So how does CEDAW, deal with that?
First, one has to inquire what Ireland is doing in other countries before one can judge from this perspective. I couldn't just, it's not black and white, even though you don't guarantee all the human rights to women in your country. It doesn't mean that through your humanitarian aid, through your development cooperation, whatever, that you are exporting your negative approach towards certain human rights standards and principles, unless I don't know whether that's true. I can't really comment that, and I still think that it's really. I do appreciate what Ireland is doing, and I know how Ireland, even though having some, together with the reservation under the CEDAW Convention, how advanced are your diplomats in the international realm. I was myself responsible for representing European Union in 2008 at the Commission on the status of women, because Slovenia was chairing the European Union. And in New York, I was negotiating in the name of European Union and having meetings every day with all the European Union member states. And it was agreed conclusions on financing for gender equality. So it means a lot of very hot potatoes issues, including sexual and reproductive health and rights and services. And Ireland never blocked a very, very good forward-looking text. It was always blocked by the other two European Union member states that have also limitation in respect to sexual and reproductive health and rights. So I was always very proud to work with Irish diplomats and experts, because they were saying that's our problem, and with our problem we don't want to limit the life and opportunities in the life of women in other parts of the world. Because we know that Europe played a role of an avant-garde at international level, and by expanding the membership of European Union, Europe is now, walking backwards quite a lot, and we have Latin America that is now much more advanced than Europe seems to be, and not an easy feeling when you are observing this. So if that would suffice you in expecting what I was supposed to say, and if I can just say something about CEDAW complaint mechanisms, exhaustion of domestic remedies, and reservations. Yeah? First of all, I would like to say that even the state party has reserved itself from being obliged to under certain provisions of the convention, if those reservations are incompatible with the meaning and the very essence of the treaty, the CEDAW committee does not accept this, and you can, after exhausting of domestic remedies or not, because the remedies because of the prolonged process expected, or because the remedies that would be available would not really remedy the situation, you can still use them. But we were speaking about individual communications under optional protocol, which of course has criteria and requirements to be fulfilled for using the individual communication procedure. But now there are inquiries, and for inquiries you don't need to exhaust domestic remedies. And I would like to say that currently 3 inquiries have been concluded with the reports available on the website, and one was on sexual and reproductive health and rights in the Philippines. I was myself a rapporteur and the drafter of that report, and I visited the country in situ, and they have a reservation. And I think that report, our interpretation and the recommendation we made has established what is the CEDAW committee standard in relation to sexual and reproductive health rights and services. Because it is one, really, it went one step further. Usually the recommendation were somehow country-specific with the attention to certain, cultural context, historical context, and in that one we decided that, standards are equal, they are universal, and so, for instance, I was thinking, if I was with you working as an activist now that I'm retired and I have time to do that, for instance, for your constitution, I know that constitution is above the ratified human rights treaty, but what comes through implementing those principles in constitution with regard to the role of women in family, using Article 5, we have 2 cases of and it does not refer anymore, to that family line, but Article 5 is about stereotyped roles of women and men in family and society. And that's something that you don't need individual complaint. It's systematic discrimination, and for an inquiry, the violation need to be even grave or systematic, not and or systematic. So it means, and now I see that NGOs from the state parties to the convention are using more and more inquiries. The problem is that for inquiry there is no technical assistance at the Office of the High Commissioner, because we have the petition unit for all the treaty bodies only under individual communications, where the complaint mechanisms exist. and very few human rights treaty bodies can require a procedure, which means an inquiry can be initiated by the CEDAW committee on its own. The CEDAW committee will never do this because it has so many requests which are awaiting there, because it means that you have no secretariat, no support, no unit that will support you, and that you have to do it, the designated experts have to do it all on their own, and that in addition, due to financial restriction, only one visit per year in the country, if the visit in the country is required, in order to clarify after you realize that information received is reliable enough to start an inquiry.
Just give Sinead and Patricia just a chance if you wanted to maybe come in on the complaints question, the Mandamela case, or what's the issue as you raise in terms of mental health.
I'll leave that to Fred.
Sure.
Just wanted to say one word about any potential contradiction between the article of the Constitution and the Convention. We have to bear in mind that Ireland is a dualist country, and therefore the Convention doesn't form part of our domestic law. And I think that would be argued first, and then secondly that it is up to the electorate then to change, because that's how our Constitution is changed. It has been changed a lot, as we know. So I do see that as a bit of a focus here, the difficulty. Because if one reads over the period since we have ratified it, if we read the Irish responses, it always is, for example, in relation to transposition and in relation to a definition of equality and discrimination. We have all that in our domestic legislation, and Ireland considers that its domestic law conforms. And that has been my experience with, for example, the Economic and Social Charter of the Council of Europe. Ireland will always consider that what it does is in fact in conformity. So how does one move forward? So I think dualism and the Constitution major big block.
Yeah, just in relation to the SCCPR, there's similar requirement around access to domestic remedies, but I presume it was obviously so futile for that one to take place through the constitutional courts in Ireland because of the Eighth Amendment, that didn't prove a barrier to her taking her complaint straight to the. I think Violetta has made that point. You don't have to exhaust futile processes at a national level before you can take a complaint, but you do have to use the ones that are available to you and offer some prospect of success. In relation to the Eighth Amendment itself, I don't think that it would be impossible to make a complaint on that basis because it's very much live law. It's impacting on women every day. So once the issue is still live, it can be looked at. It's just if something was finite in the past and you can't find a thread running through to the present, that you would be excluded from taking a complaint. In relation to the NCRPD, I'm not close enough to that process now really to comment. I knew the Defence Forces were looking for a reservation and I'm sure they get it. I didn't think it was a wider one, but obviously we're better informed than I am on that front, so that may well be the case.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. So just so that you know how the rest of today is going to go, we're going to stop now for lunch, and then what we've done is we've chosen 6 areas that we really that you have prioritised in terms of the submissions that have come into the Women's Council around what people see as some of the core priorities in terms of issues for you, but also issues then for the shadow report. So what we're going to do is sort of like a World Cafe style, that to give people a chance to really have an input on each of the issues. There's 6 issues that you can see on the agenda. Now we're going to bring together austerity and economic empowerment. So there'll be 5, and then there'll be 20 minutes on each to move around. So you can have an input on them all. So it's very much a participative piece in terms of the shadow report. So we're going to break for lunch now, and just before we break, I really want to say thanks to Sinead, Patricia and Violetta. We're also really delighted as well they're staying in terms of participate in it as part of the discussion. You're not, that's fine, Sinead, that's perfect. That's fine, well, thank you. And I think that was, I mean, I found that really useful and valuable. I know there was a huge amount of information, but yeah, it was certainly really beneficial. So thanks to the three of you. And we'll be back at 1:30 and there's lunch at the back of the room. Sorry. Oh, no, that's fine, that's fine. Sorry, I should have said that. Yeah, I should have thank you for clarity.
I can leave here. Now, I'm going first out.
Sure, yeah.